Bro. Good evening. This is Real Talk, History as a Weapon in the Struggle for Black Liberation, and I'm your host, Dr. Sundiata Keita Cha-Jua. Today, we have a very special guest, Mr. Dedrick Asante-Muhammad. He's a longtime thought leader focused on racial economic inequality. He started his work as the Racial Justice Wealth Divide Coordinator at the United for a Fair Economy. He then went on to work with Chuck Collins at the Institute for Policy Studies, Inequality, and the Common Good program. Dedrick then became Senior Director of the Economic Department of the NAACP and currently is the Chief of Organizing, Policy, and Equity of the National Community Reinvestment Coalition. He also sits on a variety of boards, including the Advancing Black Strategies Initiative, National League of Cities Racial Wealth Divide Initiative, Financial Health Networks Pulse, and Better Markets. Let me bring him into the studio.
Yes, sir.
Hey, Brother Asante-Muhammad, I'm a longtime fan, and I understand that this Tuesday you released the 2023 issue of the Steal the Dream, that annual series that looks at African American economic status.
Yes, and actually, it was released about a month ago. It was released in August, celebrating the anniversary of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. But yes, sir, we recently released one of the most recent reports we've done, kind of looking over, as I've done throughout my career, the racial wealth divide and looking at the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom in 1963 and seeing how much progress has been made.
Well, I want to save that and work to it. That'll be the bulk of what we talk about. But I want to talk about some other things. First, I want to allow you to introduce yourself to our audience. I'm a kind of a devotee of William Cross, the African-American psychologist who developed the theory of negrescence, or the process of Negro to Black conversion. And so I'd like to ask people about their background. I'm interested in how you made the decision that you would focus your career on studying the racial wealth gap. And so what I want to do, if you could give us some background about the time and the place and that you were raised, your formative years, and talk about your class background, and you can dive into any mentors, experiences, observations, readings that led you to the career that you now have as really the top Black economist.
Well, I thank you for that. I don't know if I wouldn't call myself the top Black economist, but I'm glad that I've had a career where I've got to engage with many important Black economists. So was born back in 1973, just turned 50 years old this past May. My parents, my father's a Black man, was born in Little Rock, Arkansas, then moved to Los Angeles to be with his mother and family. He was about 11 or 12. He went in Little Rock. His childhood's classmates were part of the Little Rock Nine. So it's kind of moving that classic, moving the South segregation to more of an urban center, north, but, west, Los Angeles, and seeing kind of moving from classic Southern segregation racism to urban kind of big city racism without without strict legal Jim Crow. My mother is a white woman from Alabama who grew up in Alabama, got involved with the civil rights movement, was kicked out of her college for being involved with the civil rights movement, eventually went to Newark, New Jersey, where she was doing some organizing with a famous white radical there named Tom Hayden. Was kind of exposed to kind of Black radical thinking. Was there during the Newark riots of '67, which was, I think, really important for her. And my father and her met when he was in New York. She was in Newark. They got together, got married, moved to a place called Columbia, Maryland, which was celebrated or promoted as a place welcoming to Black-white couples, interracial children, and raised me in Columbia. And I've actually moved back to Columbia to raise my family. Saying all that to say that race was important in my life. I was not actually allowed to visit my mother's side of the family until I was around 23 or 24. My mother pushed me a lot to do a lot of reading of Martin Luther King, Malcolm X. I had read most of Martin Luther King's works by the age of 13. And I think probably Martin, and then got into a bit around Stokely Carmichael, Charles Hamilton's Black Power, The Politics of Liberation, I think was the subtitle. Right. And both King's later books, Where Do We Go From Here, Chaos, Our Community, and Black Power by Stokely Carmichael, and even the autobiography of Malcolm X to a lesser extent, were highlighting, issues of economics and racial inequality. Black Power calling out institutional racism, and Where to Go From Here, Martin Luther King, highlighting that. So I had that ideas in my head at a pretty young age, wanting to learn more about that. And with studying Malcolm X, I started listening a bit to Louis Farrakhan, Honorable Louis Farrakhan on the radio, and he also would talk a decent amount about economics. Went to college, went to an elite college up in the Northeast, up in the mountains. Sorry, what'd you say?
Were you ever a member of the nation?
I am a member of the nation.
Okay, you are a member of the nation.
I remember I joined the Nation of Islam at 23 after college. I went to college looking at studying political science and economics, seeing that importance, but found that too much to do that and my activism. So I just did political science, but actually ended up doing my political science thesis around the Nation of Islam. Actually, it was funny. A white professor, Louis Farrakhan, was becoming bigger and bigger. This was like 1990 or something like that. It was becoming bigger and bigger.
In the 90s.
What'd you say?
He was very big in the 90s.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. And this is 1990.
Million Man March or after?
It was before the Million Man March, because it was 1990. The Million Man March was 1995. But it was like, I think Minister Louis Farrakhan was on the cover of Time magazine, was getting a decent amount of media attention. And a political science professor, I think he wanted to know more about it. So he asked me to start writing about it. And then I started writing about it. And I started going to mosque out in Albany. And then within about a year later, I would join the Nation of, actually, you're right. Because I went to 91. The Million Man March was 95, right after I graduated. And I started processing about that time and joined around 96, I think. Okay. So joined the Nation of Islam. Did some different work at colleges, multicultural centers. I ended up working at a maximum security prison for women for a bit. And then I ended up working for Reverend Al Sharpton. I ended up working for Reverend, I was living in New York, I was in Harlem, and I ended up, I was doing anti-police brutality protests. And me and my sister went to one. I think this was around, maybe it was around Amadou Diallo. I'm not sure. There's so many different.
What was Diallo about? 97?
That sound, maybe 98.
Yeah.
Something like that. Yeah, 98, 99. And was doing some anti-police brutality protest, and an officer put his hands on my sister and started pushing her around, and I helped the officer get his hands off my sister. And then about 6 officers helped the other officer and ended up, a little bruised up, not bad, but arrested. And Sharpton, at his Harlem rallies once a month, he would just take anyone who wanted to talk to him. And, just after the rally. So I went and talked to him about my case. And he actually didn't really help me that much about my case, but he found it interesting. He found me interesting. And I ended up working for him. And that was very interesting. And one of the things I was most interested about when working with Reverend Sharpton, it was great. Travel the country, travel the world. This is when Sharpton is really trying to make himself more of a national leader and less just of a New York leader. But I was surprised at how much he was engaged in economic issues. And it brought me back to some of the readings I had been reading as a kid. And so after I stopped working for Reverend Sharpton, my first job after working with Reverend Sharpton was being the racial wealth divide coordinator at United for a Fair Economy. And that's when I started doing this racial wealth divide work. I was very lucky to get into this space that was really just starting around 2003.
90s, yeah. 90s. So a question for you. You mentioned that Black Power had an influence on you. Does that extend to the theory of internal colonialism?
Sure. Yeah. No, definitely. And I had gotten involved in studying international politics, anti-globalization. I had traveled to different countries, Peru and Cuba. So this whole idea of fighting against colonialism, and then looking at the Black community as an internal colony, internal colonization. All of those ideas, as I was, reading and studying kind of other Black radical thought, those definitely were prominent.
Good. So I want to switch and, forgive my lack of knowledge in some areas, but as near as I can tell, the 2004 issue, The State of the Dream, Enduring Disparities in Black and White, was the first social to use popular education methodology. And was that the first one that United for Fair Economy did?
It was the first State of the Dream that was done. The State of the Dream report I created when I started. I started in 2003, and I was.
So then, tell me about that process.
Yeah,
So you created a dream. Why King State of a Dream? Why that riff?
Sure. So I had read, so much about King. Every year I was, reading, parts of his work. Testament of Hope, kind of a collection of King's works, and every year would go back to that. And people talk about post-racial as being something happening in the Obama administration, but people were talking post-racial when Bill Clinton was in office, right? In 2000, they were trying to act like he was the first Black president, and that we were past racial divisions.
Absolutely, 96, yeah.
Yes, that's right. And so, but when I had this job to be United for a Fair Economy and to focus on racial wealth gap, it's interesting to talk a little bit about how racial wealth gap organizing developed. Because it had funding attached to it. I think that's how my position was able to be created. I was looking at ways to try to highlight to the masses, what is the state of inequality? Because I think people didn't even really recognize that there was deep racial economic inequality. Most people were thinking that we had bridged most of it and we just had a little bit way to go. And so I had looked at the Urban League's annual reports, but had thought that we needed something, and two, even the celebration of Dr. King was becoming more and more mainstream, was a federal holiday, what have you, and I wanted to try to take the celebration of Dr. King's birthday and try to make it more of an analysis of where we are with racial inequality. So that's where I came up with this idea of State of a Dream. I also thought looked at the State of the Union and was which is also happening around that time, and said, hey, so let's have a State of the Dream. Let's look, we all celebrate Dr. King and we say we embrace his dream. Well, where are we as it relates to racial economic equality? which was a central part of that speech and of Dr. King's work. And so that's where I came up with the idea of a State of the Dream report.
Great idea. I mean, it's a phenomenal hook for sure. So when you looked at the Urban League reports and you found something wanting, so what did you think was missing or not done as sharply as you felt it needed to be articulated?
Yeah, it was several things. One, like I think, and this happens sometimes, it tries to be so expansive that it's hard to have any clear takeaways from it, right? It was just like so they focus on education. I think they did something on unemployment. They started doing health.
They had chapters on many aspects. Yes.
Yeah, that's right. And with a whole bunch of different writers, but it was just, there was no clear, I mean, most people aren't going to sit down. I would look at it and I thought it would be interesting to pull out some different pieces, but it was not something that most people could take away. Oh, this is where we are in terms of, race and economics. And so I just wanted something, more focused, more to the point, and more helping to highlight the idea of racial income and racial economic inequality, the racial wealth divide. Though in that first report, there's very little information about wealth because we didn't really have much data on wealth. But
the concept is fairly new at that point, right?
Yes. No, that's right. And with the whole, a lot of people don't know this, but really what brought together those of us studying racial wealth gap was a far-sighted woman at the Ford Foundation who really believed that this was an important analysis and had, I think, their first meeting in 2000, maybe 2 or 2003. I went to the second meeting of experts, including people like Derek Hamilton, who's become pretty well known. He was at that second meeting I was at, which was held at Tuskegee. Mostly Black economists, Sandy Darity, William Darity, as well as a white person who'd written a lot, Thomas Shapiro, on the racial wealth divide. And so it was her at the Ford Foundation funding organizations that really was the basis for a lot of the economists and scholars who would be writing about it for the last 20 years.
That is really interesting. One of the things that I always felt about the Urban League studies is that you could, of course, pick and choose and find some very good ones, but as a study, it lacked a unifying voice. And I thought that what you guys did was that you brought a very, one, it was a team as opposed to a collection of disparate individuals, and that y'all brought a more unified voice to it that lended it a greater level of power, as well as the single focus that those reports had.
And I'll tell you one positive thing too. I think that it really wasn't funded the first report or two, and so I could really do what I wanted to do. You know what I mean? It's like I could see with the Urban League report that, oh, this year someone's funding it who wants to focus on health disparities. So it'd be focused on health. And, oh, this one is related, I think, to voter registration. So it's going in this way. So I've been in the nonprofit world for a while, and I find that usually my strongest writings come from unfunded reports because I could really just get to the point instead of having to write to the funder, which I understand is part of the business, but it usually does weaken.
No, that's good. Now, the distinction I make is like Darity and Hamilton and people like Jim Stewart put out a lot of stuff, but it's not necessarily accessible. And I don't mean accessible in terms of the writing. I just mean in terms of the venues that it's published in. You guys stuff have, I think, a much broader reach because of how you package it, and that it's often digital.
Yes. Yeah, I think, and I think that became my space in the kind of racial wealth divide, racial wealth gap authors, advocates is, William Darity and Derek Hamilton are trained economists, PhD economists, and are writing things to help their academic career, which is totally fine, right? And needed to be published in certain journals and written certain ways and use, particular methods in order to kind of do that. Myself, I was writing for the public. I was writing as an advocate trying to get a message out. So I didn't need it to be in, a journal that maybe a few academics read, but most people didn't. So I was the one more likely oftentimes. I mean, Derek Hamilton now is on a lot of, it's kind of like the slow burn or fast burn. I immediately went to the press and get on, different things, different radio shows, different TV shows. Derek Hamilton, over years of building up his academic credentials, is now looked at by, national TV shows or what have you. But I think between 2003 and 2015, you could more oftentimes find a lot of my things in popular media, though now Derek Hamilton and William Darity are seen everywhere.
Yeah.
Particularly Derek. Yeah.
That's true. Can you have a very succinct refutation of the SCOTUS's reversal of affirmative action. And I just want to read a quote from you, in which you say, the foundation of racial inequality is racial economic inequality, and the foundation of racial economic inequality is the racial wealth divide. So can you unpack that sentence for the audience?
No, I appreciate that you highlight that, because that is the kind of catchphrase I try to use to help people understand this idea of racial wealth gap or racial wealth divide analysis. Is that, particularly in the 90s, 2000s, when I was starting off, so much, and even today, so much of racial inequality people want to get into in terms of personal prejudice and of getting past personal prejudice and can't we all just get along type stuff. And I'm trying to highlight that the foundation of racial inequality wasn't that Western Europeans who came to the U.S. just didn't get along with Black people in West Africa, or just didn't get along with indigenous people. It's that they wanted their land. And you don't get along with people whose land you're stealing. You also don't get along with people who you're stealing themselves, which are the West Africans, right? And you're stealing them not just because you're mean, but because you're looking to build wealth. You're looking to strengthen your economic position for the entire, the whole entire country. And so that's really foundational. I'm sorry, what'd you say?
Exploit their labor.
That's right. That's right. Exploit their labor for indigenous people, more so take their land and resources and build the U.S. economy, which is based off of racial economic inequality. And I think once you understand that, then you can understand why, people say, oh, in 2023 or 2020, how can things be so bad racially? Because you haven't changed the economics. You haven't changed the economics in the sense of, obviously, we don't have slavery right now. We don't have the continuance of, mass genocide of taking indigenous land, though we still have the land. We still don't have the land. But we still have this deep racial wealth inequality. And that's what I highlight, that I think wealth is the best socioeconomic indicator of a household, of individuals in American society, and this really depth of wealth inequality, which is even greater than income inequality. And
so can you explain the difference between the two and why wealth is the more important relationship?
Sure. So, income is how much you might pull in each year. I think the median household income for African Americans right now is around $52,000 a year, right? So that's how much you have coming in. Wealth is how much you have after you've kind of, paid your expenses, and what type of, you might have in a savings account, you might have a retirement account, you might have equity in a home for a small population, your value of your business, but that is wealth, what you have outside of, usually after you spent your dollars on your basic cost of life, what reserves do you have to utilize and the importance of wealth is that it's wealth that allows you to take advantage of economic opportunity. It's also wealth that allows you to get through different economic hardships. And, I think, again, the median income for Blacks is around 52,000. For whites, I think is around 71,000. So you see a substantial divide there. But in 2019, the median wealth, not including depreciating assets for African Americans, was $9,000. And for whites was $160,000. So you see that radical disparity there of wealth. And you see a disparity of wealth for middle income blacks, for high income blacks, all the way up and down the line. I've also pointed to that whites with a high school diploma have almost twice the wealth of blacks with a 4-year college degree.
Wait a minute,
right?
can you repeat that?
So whites with a high school diploma and not education beyond that have on average twice the wealth of blacks with a 4-year college degree. So even when you go to college and you might be even making more money than some of these whites in terms of income, you don't have the wealth. And that's because wealth is not something you just create quickly, right?
Mhm.
Like you need to have income over time and usually generations, right? Like I talk all the time about friends who, I'm making a 6-figure salary and that's really good. And that is really good, but you can't seem to be living the same type of lifestyle as your white colleagues. And I asked them, well, did your parents help you with a down payment for a house? And no, you had to do that yourself, which means you had to take out a bigger loan, pay more of your income for that mortgage. And aren't you helping your aunt pay her rent, right? You have other responsibilities. And so you're doing good things with your money. It's not that you're doing bad things with your money. It's just you don't have as much money to put aside to invest or to even live a more luxurious lifestyle because you're having to cover more basic costs for yourself, family, and friends.
So when you focus on the racial wealth gap, you identify 3 areas, or you seem to emphasize 3 areas: median family or household income, median family or household wealth, and home ownership. Why do you focus on those 3 areas?
Yeah, I mean, and I think there's many areas you could focus on. I think most people understand economically, they look at income, right? And so that's and it's important to look at all 3 of those areas in the disparity because one critique I'll give is that some people will get so much into the wealth thing, they'll say, well, we need to talk about income or employment anymore. And that's silly. Like we didn't get to equality in income, and now we can just focus on wealth. I just think that wealth is a stronger indicator, but we need to deal with these issues of income, right? And so I think that's one thing in general is we don't in society have a clear understanding of what is median income. How do people really live? We look at the TV and we think that people, everyone should be able to afford, a single family home, have 2 cars and send their kids to college. But the median household income, not an individual person's income.
Not family income.
This is income for everyone in one household, right? Put together. The median household income in the United States is like 65,000 or something like that.
Wait, that's across rates?
That's across rates. That's nationally.
It's only 60,000.
65,000, something like that. Yeah. So and that isn't that much, right? It's 2 people making around 30,000.
Yeah. That's exactly what it is. Yeah.
Yeah, and then trying, and we know how expensive housing is, but have you trying to buy a house with that level of income? That's a deep challenge, and unless you have family members who can help, then it's a very severe challenge. So and then to highlight that the median household income for African Americans is 52,000 household, not individual, right? I think helps people understand much more the economic pressures they're facing. Because so oftentimes we think we're doing something wrong instead of that there's a system that is doing something wrong and that people are really much more economically insecure than people generally let on, because on Facebook or X, Twitter, what have you, we try not to talk about our financial problems. We try to talk about the successes in our lives, but the financial instability, we look at income or wealth, is big. And then home ownership, I highlight. Home ownership is a major source of wealth for most middle income Americans, right? And I think it's really interesting to note that only 45% of African Americans are homeowners, while 74% of whites are homeowners. And so there's a huge disparity there. And so if you're renting, then you're paying your money in order to live in a place, but there's no wealth being built up. If you're a homeowner, and you're paying a mortgage, well, eventually, after you pay that mortgage, let's say it takes you 30 years, you have the value of the house as an asset that you can use, so you can pass on to your kid. 30 years of paying rent, you have nothing but 30 years of paying bills. That's it. You have no asset at the end.
A question that I've, even as a young person, I always wondered why you couldn't deduct rent off your taxes in the same way you do mortgage. Because if the idea was to have a society of homeowners, that would allow renters to reap something that they could then use to eventually become homeowners. I mean, it could be a conveyor belt to home ownership. And it doesn't seem like it would be that great a deal, but clearly it's never occurred.
No, and you're highlighting another aspect of how home ownership can be beneficial is we have a tax structure that allows you to do different type of deductions and credits for being a homeowner that you don't get as a renter. And which, like you says, and we highlight these in some of our past reports that the country spends, last I looked, almost $800 billion a year on wealth and asset development. The problem is it mostly goes to those who have the most wealth. And so we should be doing tax credits and tax write-offs much more for those, what I call in asset poverty, low wealth households, and invest that money in them instead of investing most of the $800 billion on the already wealthy or those who already have some wealth.
So I want to ask you a kind of question in terms of consumption. And I know that's not what you specialize in, but I got a good friend, Dr. David Crockett, and he does market analysis. And one of the things he points out is that it's in the area of consumption that Black people experience the most personal encounters with racist behavior. But the other piece of it is that we tend to pay a lot more for the things we purchase and get less quality. And how do you factor in? There's a sociologist, Eric, he calls it non-exploitative economic oppression. In other words, he accepts the Marxist definition that exploitation is a production relationship. So he wants to explain a consumption relationship. So how would you react to just the whole question of what we pay out as a people?
Yeah,
we get back.
Well, and I had developed this thing called a negative feedback loop of Black asset poverty. And one of those 5 points is the idea that inferior service from the market, or the popular saying is that it's expensive to be poor.
That's right.
So you can be in, and I've lived, I live in Columbia now. I've lived briefly, for a few years in Harlem. I lived in Dorchester, what have you. In Harlem before Whole Foods, right? It was, it wasn't the worst of Harlem, I think, but even before the Magic Johnson movie theater was in Harlem, right? So where there weren't many banks, there weren't really grocery stores, these types of things. And you would buy more expensive, let's say, food products that were of inferior quality in that space than if you were to go down 20, 30 blocks down to upper Manhattan, where you could go to a grocery store and get cheaper fruit or meat that were of higher quality. So that is, this kind of segregation, we segregate the asset poor.
Internal colony.
Yeah, internal colony. That's right. And ghettoize Black people. And historic for the last 60 years or so, that was actually more than that, I guess, like 80, 90 years. Oftentimes that was in urban centers. But now we're seeing kind of the ghettoization in suburbs of Black people, where again, we don't have access to quality products at reasonable prices.
And what's ironic? When I was a kid, 15, so this would have been like 1970 or something like that, right? There was in Chicago a place called the Topographical Center. And I think it was run by people associated with the Republic of New Africa.
Hmm.
And one of the things they had all these maps, and they would show us, for example, that black people in the state of Illinois might occupy maybe 5% of the land, but we only own 1%, something like that.
Yeah.
But they did an overlay of Chicago, Lake Michigan, Chicago, and Cape Town, South Africa. And they argued that in most of the colonial world, they put the dark-skinned people in the suburbs. And so what they suggested was that in 25 years, black people would be pushed out of the cities toward the suburbs because white folks would want to have access to the cultural resources, the museums, and that they would find it expensive, right, because of the gas problem that was beginning to emerge in the 70s. And, you know, just, I haven't done a deep study, but damn, it does look like I think now the majority of a plurality of the black population now lives in suburbs.
Yeah, no, I think
that's
that's
what
right.
we, you know, but when you say suburb, it's not what we generally have in our head when we think suburb. This is just an extension of the inner city, really.
That's right. That's right. And we've, when, you know, I remember I don't know exactly when, probably like around 2000 or something like that, was flying into Lima, Peru, and was fascinated as we flew into the city, looking outside, that the shanty towns were all outside the city. It was like so where our suburbs were surrounding a city, that's where their poorest were concentrated, and then in the city was for the higher income residents. And I've always thought about that as I see kind of what's happened with American cities, as that they, as you know, in living in Harlem, you know, seeing, or New York City, we're seeing where, okay, hey, Harlem actually is a great location. We have a train that takes you right, as an express train, takes you right down to Midtown. It's easy to get out of the city from there, but you're still connected. And you know, and white people of higher income moving in, wanting these areas back, right? Now, you know, I think it is a fascinating piece that, you know, blacks came to urban centers for jobs, right? Because that's where industry was. But by the time we got there, a lot of those industry jobs were already starting to move out. And so we get there, and after about a generation or so, the jobs are gone, but we're still there. And that leads to this idea of the inner city, you know, and to this demonization of inner city residents not having a strong work ethic, even though it was their parents and grandparents who had come there to work so hard, which is why they were there. And, it was, you know, the question is, well, why didn't you move to where the jobs were? Where the jobs didn't just weren't just moved someplace. Oftentimes through automation, we had less and less of them. Sometimes they were moved out to other countries, right?
And federal law.
More.
Federal law kept us in the inner cities and out of the suburbs for a long time in terms of loans and stuff.
Yeah. No.
You know, there's this other, there's a geographer, Neil Smith, and he's drawing on Marx, and he makes the point that capital moves from developed areas to underdeveloped areas, meaning that they go to where land is cheap, they build it up, and then, you know, 80 years or so, it's running down, and then they go to another area, and they move with capital. And it seems to me that, you know, if we study the migration of black folk, it tends to confirm that what we're witnessing now through gentrification and through the use, the political use of the Section 8 vouchers. Like, I know they tell folk in Chicago, if you want to come down to Champaign, Decatur, Peoria, we can get you in a place this week. But if you want to stay in Chicago, you're going to be on a long waiting list. And so they're redistributing, systematically redistributing the population so that we have less political impact.
Well, and I mean, and also too, I think there is, like I said, I live in Columbia, Maryland. We're right by Baltimore. And I know that some people in Baltimore City, when they have the vouchers, you know, will try to go to Columbia, and we'll do go to Columbia because there's stronger public resources, right? And I think, you know, that does make sense that can be a positive thing. We have a stronger public education system, stronger kind of public parks, all these types of things. So there's reason to do that. But while at the same time, it still is not, it is also oftentimes dispersing populations, and whatever maybe Black institutions that were there are strong Black populations that might have allowed for some political power that also is getting broken up, so there's the positives and the negatives.
Absolutely. So let's talk about the report.
Okay.
It came out in August. It's entitled "Still a Dream: Over 500 Years of Black Economic Equality," and I think there's even another subtitle, right?
Over 500 years of Black economic equality. Yeah, Black economic inequality, 60 years after the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And you were noting how that framing was strong. I used in 2003, and it's kind of been the framing for my career, because you see now, 20 years later, I'm still using. I'm not called State of the Dream because I left that with United for a Fair Economy and was very honored that they did, 18 reports using that even after I left. But, borrowing from that, still a dream, that framing of looking back and seeing, all right, well, because I think the original State of the Dream was looking at, since the time of Martin Luther King's death, how Blacks were doing.
Right.
This one's looking at it since this time of the March on Washington, how Blacks are doing since the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom 60 years ago this past August.
So how are we doing?
Yeah. Well, I try to start off with in some areas of progress, because I think it's important to understand actually where we were in 63. And one of the things I highlight was that I was 63 or 61, 51% of African Americans were in income poverty, right? And that's that's radically high. I think it's just I don't know if most of us appreciate the deep economic insecurity and turmoil that most African Americans were living in. Because even if you weren't in poverty, you could be just above poverty. You're still in deep economic insecurity. Like I think today, income poverty is judged. I think a household of three, $24,000, right? So if you have $30,000, you're still in deep economic insecurity for a household of three, right? So but just because you're not in poverty doesn't mean you're doing well. But again, 51% of African Americans were living in poverty, I think 1961. And what's interesting is that, we had seen decreases in poverty happening in the 40s and 50s. The American economy was stronger and stronger. There was movements of desegregation, of allowing Blacks to be hired in more jobs. And then there was the war on poverty.
Right.
It was going strong in 1964. Very important programs, Office of Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, that really radically cut down poverty for the elderly. And in 5 years, by 69, Black poverty rate had gone down to 32%. So that was real. And I think that's really something actually I would like to think more about. That in the 60s, where there was such deep struggle by Blacks, it was actually a time of great socioeconomic progress that is something I think my generation and generations younger than me probably can't even get our heads wrapped around, of such economic progress, because we've had much less economic progress in 10-year periods since the 70s, definitely the 80s, where we saw kind of a stagnation, 90s, 2000s, and now 2020. So I do think that's interesting that we had such militant, powerful protest at a time where we saw poverty decreasing by so much. And by 2020, 2021, Black poverty, is more around, at high points around 20%, which is still high. It's still 1 out of 5 Blacks, but it's still radically lower than what it was in, say, the 1960s. So that's one area we've seen substantial progress.
So let me tease out a couple of things here. One is, I think there's a relationship between the struggle and the shrinking of gaps of oppression. I don't think that those things are incidental. I think that there's a straight dialectical relationship, that whenever there's a historical moment in which there's high Black struggle, there will also be a moment in which we advance politically and economically and socially. And that whenever quietude or ineffectiveness characterizes our social movements, things get worse in every kind of category. So that would be one thing I'd want to see teased out. The other piece is how do you respond to the conservatives? I'm thinking of a guy, Tom Scott. Well, I once called him Tom Scott, and a former friend of mine from graduate school, excuse me, I called him Tim Scott, and a former friend from graduate school told me that down there in South Carolina, they call him Tom Scott. Obvious reasons, right? Well, he would make an argument that would, in effect, say that the social programs of the 1960s made things worse economically for Black people. And the data that you're just reeling off, and you took the time to highlight the anti-poverty programs and those things. So how would you just, respond to this guy in a minute?
Well, I mean, again, I would just highlight pre the war on poverty, pre those poverty programs, African Americans, majority of us were in poverty.
Right.
After we were included, it went down almost 20%, our poverty rates, and have continued to go down, not to the level it should, but down to around 20%. So the idea that these poverty programs made things worse just doesn't correlate with time in history of what has happened. It is interesting how much that was the dominant narrative in the 80s, even in the 90s, right? Where Bill Clinton, our first Black president, was ending welfare as we know it, because supposedly the idea was that welfare was the problem, versus that we weren't investing in creating opportunity for inner city residents who had moved, whose parents and grandparents had moved to the cities for jobs, and the jobs left. And it wasn't like, let's bring jobs there. It's like, well, no, they're getting lazy. They're using welfare. And it's interesting that, things become negative and criminal when we get access to it, right? Because there was Social Security, there was welfare that was much more available to white people. But then when we start having a civil rights movement to say Blacks should get all the government programs that whites get, then government programs become bad. And we should have them. We should be cutting them back.
And that's certainly for sure what they have done since then. So So you highlight the areas in which we are actually beginning to shrink the gap. Now, is the gap that we're shrinking the gap from where we were at one point in the past and where we are now, or is it also the disparity between us and white Americans, or both?
No, that's there's different ways of looking at it, and you're bringing up a good point. In '63, you should get yourself some water, like I got. Yeah, that's yes, sir. The poverty rate for Blacks was 51%. For whites, it was 15%. By 2021, the poverty rate for Blacks is 20%, and the poverty rate for whites is 8%. So I do believe that gap has bridged a bit. Probably not as much as we'd want, but has bridged a bit. And there's looking at the gap, but I also will note, even if the gap didn't bridge, the fact that we went down from 51 to 20% still is important progress. I mean, the gap's important, but it's also, that was so substantial that I think, that was something that had to be noted. In high school education was an area where the gap has almost been eliminated. High school educational attainment with whites, because we were at around 25%. It's interesting. Only 25% of Blacks graduated from high school in 1962. But by 2020, 90% of blacks are graduating from high school, and that's about where whites are. So we've almost bridged that. Now, you can critique that idea that a high school diploma doesn't get you the same type of job opportunities as it did in the 60s, and that is true.
Right.
But even in terms of college attainment, in 1962, whites were 2.4 times more likely to have a college degree. And in 2020 or 2022, whites were 1.7 times more. So still a substantive difference, but there has been a slow bridging, even as it connects to higher education. And again, I think it's just important because people want to act like blacks are just not making the right choices. But I'm trying to highlight that no, we actually have bridged some of this inequality as it relates to education in terms of poverty. But we're going to see it still hasn't turned into bridging much in terms of income or wealth.
But that has more to do, your suggestion, with the institutions that we have less control of.
Yes, yeah. And that, a point that I get into is a look in more and more data that, even when we quote unquote do things right, we get college education, we get a house, we don't get the same type of wealth returns on those as whites.
Why not?
So there's wealth returns, and I'll even say in terms of employment, oftentimes even income returns. And I think, again, it's because of the racial wealth divide, meaning that, well, one, you don't get the same type of wealth returns because if you have no wealth, it takes and your cohort has a little bit of wealth to start off with. It's a lot harder for you to catch up to that, right?
Right.
And so even if you're having a pretty good job, it's harder for you to catch up. Two, you can't take the same type of risks that someone with some wealth or who has a family with wealth can take. So this idea that you're just going to go start a business in your family's garage and put in for 5 years, and if it goes great, now you can become a millionaire, and if it doesn't, well, then you can just go get a job someplace else. Many of us who graduate from households with little or no wealth, we need to bring in income right away to help our parents, help our family, and cover our own bills, and can't take the same type of financial risk that might have great wealth returns in the future. But we need immediate income returns now in order to support ourselves and our family. So that's enough. And then too, in terms of home ownership, there is outright racial discrimination in that a home in a majority black neighborhood does not have the same market value as the exact same home in a majority white neighborhood. Whites generally don't want to live in neighborhoods that have, like, now, whites don't mind, a black house, maybe 10% black population. Once you get to 15, 20%, the market values goes down. And since whites still have the most income and the most buyers, whites' preference determines the market value of your home in black neighborhoods. So you can buy that home, but you're not going to get the same type of returns as you do in predominantly white neighborhoods.
Can you talk about, let me see, is the phrase, it's kind of like trying to sell a home when you're black, de-blackening the home so you can sell it?
Yeah, and I think actually there's some weakness in this analysis of appraisal gap. I think there's oftentimes when I'll put forth when liberals want to talk about racism, they still fall into this idea of personal prejudice. And so they want to get to this idea that the problem is individual racist appraisers. And every once in a while that does happen, right? Like, I'm sure, we've done testing at the organization I work for, that shows individual prejudice. But again, I think the much larger problem is not that if this one house, if you have black art in it and pictures of a black family, you take that out.
Let me interject. I'm not talking about disparities in appraisal. I'm talking about you can't, white folks won't buy your house if they know black folks was in it. That's what I'm trying to talk about.
Well, but I think more so, I think a much bigger issue is I think whites are more likely to buy a black house in a white neighborhood because it's a white neighborhood than buy even a white house in a majority black neighborhood.
Okay. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I see that. Yeah.
That's my
Absolutely.
point.
But look, in the report, you got this phrase that there are a few areas in which the gap has been shrinking, and then you got below that there are many areas in which it hasn't. So do you want to say a little bit more about areas where we have in fact been making some progress before we turn to that vast sea where you're suggesting things have either been stagnant or regressive?
Yeah, well, I mean, and there are some areas I didn't mention where I think there might have been progress, but again, I think the most important indicators are the areas where we haven't made progress. Like again, like I do think like voting and these types of things. Yes, we've made progress. We really didn't get into that in the report. I will put interestingly, just over the last few years, up until about 2016, you could generally say African Americans had twice the unemployment rate of whites, and that was consistent
Right.
since the 60s. Then in 2018, we started seeing some record low levels of black unemployment. We're getting down to 5%, 6% unemployment for blacks, which was, record low levels because usually we were between 7 and 10%, or in the 90s, we were, between 74 and 94, we were in double digits. And so we'd seen some decreasing of this disparity. And so blacks might have 1.6, 1.7 times unemployment rate of whites. So that's positive. And I want to note it's important we continue that, and not when the recession occurs, it blows it all up and we go back to the twice. But unemployment's a place we've seen some improvement just over the last few years. But now we can get into the two main areas I look at, income and wealth, where we really haven't seen much improvement at all.
And that's since 63.
That's in 63. And you can go back further. There's a professor, I think she's at Princeton, Laura Dorencourt, who did a paper looking at racial wealth gap and some interesting measurements she did from 1860 to 2020. And that was really interesting, showing how, the greatest bridging of racial wealth inequality happened, obviously, right after the end of slavery, right? Because blacks could actually work and sell their labor and weren't the actual just property of whites. And then, kind of how it went over, and then kind of, her paper shows, I think from about the 1980s on, we haven't really seen much improvement in bridging the racial wealth gap. So that's even a larger historical look. This was just looking at from 1963 to today. And we highlight with income that in 1967, African Americans had 58 cents of every dollar that white Americans made. And in 2021, African Americans had 62 cents on every dollar that white households made. So that's 60 years. We saw a bridging of the gap of 4 cents. At 4 cents, 60 years. And so at that rate, it would take black households 513 years just to reach income equality with white households. And so, and again, I like to point back to, Dr. King was talking about, we can't deal with gradualism, the fierce urgency of now. He was saying this. And, I think it's important to remember the March on Washington. He would talk about 100 years later, black people are still in an aisle of poverty in the midst of a sea of prosperity. And when he said 100 years later, he meant 100 years since the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. And I'm kind of highlighting in this report, and 60 years after King was talking about 100 years later, 160 years later, African Americans are still in this island of poverty amidst an ocean of prosperity. And we see this in income, and we see this even worse in terms of wealth, where it would take around 800 years for African Americans to reach in wealth equality with whites at the rate since the 60s.
The political status and things like that remain stable, and that there's not a big movement to push us further back, right?
We know, yeah, no, that's if we do as well as we have been doing.
Yeah, yeah,
We right, so we could do better, or we could do worse.
yeah.
But I think what it really shows is without radical change, we are no way on a path to economic equality. We're on a path of ongoing racial economic apartheid. Like that is the path we're on without radical changes.
So you guys do propose some radical changes. You got some recommendations. So can you speak to the type of policy changes that you recommend in the report?
Yeah, and we note in the report that the whole idea of middle class society, of majority of whites being homeowners, these things didn't happen, just happened by themselves. There were mass investments, mass government programs that created these opportunities. GI Bill, which allowed for 0% down payment on homes, this kind of massive subsidy of home ownership that allowed whites to become majority homeowners. And we would need similar such programs if we want blacks and even Latinos, who are around 49% homeowners, and they're such a large part of the population now. I think 17-18% of the population, and will continue to grow. That even if we want really the future of America to be middle class in terms of wealth, home ownership, these types of things, we have to reinvest and into the new America, including African Americans, to have not the majority of America in deep asset poverty, which isn't something that has been, which is something that hasn't been the history for the last 60 years. And we, pointed to things like calls for, and Dr. King was calling for this, full employment, guaranteed jobs, massive land and home ownership programs. We get more into the details of this. A commitment to individual asset building. Sandy Darity and Derek Hamilton were known early on in the racial wealth divide space for this idea of baby bonds, where you actually either all Americans or certain groups of Americans, when they're born, get some type of bond, $1,000, $10,000. It might be added to every year. And then by the time they are 18 or 21, they have this capital, which they can then use to help, them go forward in life. And we have some places like Connecticut that has started a baby bond program. Washington, D.C. is just starting a baby bond program. It'll be interesting to see. Again, it's going to take a long time for them to come to fruition because it's just starting. It won't be until they're 18 that people can actually utilize it. And then we also know targeted reparations is also kind of the most cost-effective, efficient way to deal with the racial wealth divide for Black people. I think people talk about reparations as just like this kind of crazy big idea, but if you really want to deal with the racial wealth divide, racial economic marginalization of Black people, the most targeted way to deal with this would be to have reparations program that focused on these communities that could be things like a baby bond program aimed at them, could be free college, could be subsidies or subsidies on different type of job training, job placement programs. These types of things, would probably be the most cost-effective way to address it, even though the America's never had the will for that type of, direct talk. Though we are hearing more about reparations.
Changing. Yeah, the numbers are really changing in that regard. But I feel like my fellow co-editors will be angry at me if I don't do a shameless plug. You and Chuck Collins have a piece on reparations and recommending some of the programs that you just discussed in a book entitled Reparations and Reparatory Justice that I, Mary Frances Berry, and VP Franklin are the co-editors of. That's coming out in March from the University of Illinois Press. So if you want to say something about that piece, feel free.
No, actually, I'm glad you're reminding me that it's coming out in March.
Yeah.
We should definitely talk because we have NCRC has our conference in April, and we were talking about doing something around reparations. So we should have, you in attendance to talk about that book.
Sounds good. Sounds good. So I want to raise this question, right? I come at the world through largely a Marxist lens, filtered through people like Du Bois and C.L.R. James and Nkrumah.
Yes, sir.
So labor is important to me in terms of how we begin to transform. And so you don't talk a lot about labor exploitation in your analysis. So can you give us some sense of where you see that in terms of the historic and current conditions of Black folk, the role of labor exploitation?
I mean, and you're right in that I don't talk much about it outside of kind of an aside of the foundation of the racial wealth divide. That I mean, that was, the kind of Black people as people and their labor were, taken as a foundation of wealth building for what would become, America's economy. And don't really get into so much, and I'm sure there are many who focus much more on this, but can get on that the discrimination and segregation of Black people created a labor pool that was cheaper and could be exploited for greater profits and to keep even white labor more in line. Similarly to how some immigrant labor forces used to keep, citizens' labor force in line, because you can always utilize that for, accumulating greater profit. So definitely don't dive into that as much as just kind of highlighting the reality of deep economic inequality, not so much getting into the mechanics of the profit making in this economy of racial inequality.
So I kind of want to wrap this up. So I want to kind of ask you one last question and then give you a chance to raise to make any statements that you want before I go to the chat and pull out a question. So you've written a lot about Dr. King and how he remained hopeful. So what keeps you hopeful?
Yeah, Reverend Sharpton used to talk about the difference between. Oh, so let me pause and make sure you're okay.
Forgive me, man. Nah.
No. I understand that you are sick,
I'm
and I appreciate that you did this interview, pushing on to do this interview despite your sickness. You all right?
Thank you, brother. I appreciate it. Yeah, I'm okay.
Okay. I was just going to say that when I was working for Reverend Sharpton, he used to talk a lot about the difference between having hope and having faith. And I do think for me, it is more of this idea of having faith, understanding that, struggle is long, struggle is eternal. And I'm not fighting because I think I'm going to win next week. I'm fighting because I think what is ahead of me is unjust. And the only proper response is to fight this. So, and I think someone who's been talking for 20 years about how the racial wealth divide isn't closing, you have to stay motivated. And that's why I'll try to take little victories. Like again, the one of the things we have seen is there's much more talk about the racial wealth gap and racial wealth divide now than there was 20 years ago.
Well, absolutely.
Yeah, like literally 15 years ago, if there was an article written about it, I knew that person, because it was that small. Right now, everyone is writing some aspects of it. I just want to get to the point we're not just writing about it, we're actually doing something about it.
Mm-hmm. Good. So is there anything that you want to say that you feel like you missed, particularly in terms of the recent report that came out, or any general statement that you want to go back and just speak to? Some question that I probably should have asked and didn't.
No. I mean, I want to say, I appreciate your approach of being able to get into the kind of the personal stories, personal narrative of how you got to this work. And I think too, it's important, even though the phrase racial wealth gap, racial wealth divide hasn't been used for that long, it's still based on analysis, that happened decades ago. I think, people have had, since Reconstruction, before Reconstruction, there was a recognition that you had to have wealth and economic development in order to have greater equality in society or as a people. So, I look at what I'm doing as building off of these historic traditions and much more radical traditions, and I hope that those who listen to Black Power Media can find some things helpful in this analysis as they're continuing struggle in their communities.
Well, thank you. I mean, I really appreciate you coming on. And it took us a while to get this together, but it's been very, very good. So I got a question from Quaker anarchists, and they're interested to hear what readings you would recommend to accompany your work. Also, do you have a website where they can find your work?
Sure. If you want to find my writings, you can go to Bridging the Racial Wealth Divide .wordpress, or you can just Google Bridging the Racial Wealth Divide WordPress, and that has most of my writings, for the last 20 years. I also do a lot of work with the Institute for Policy Studies, and their inequality.org website's a great website that highlights different areas of economic inequality. And then I work at an organization called the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, and they do a lot more advocacy around the Community Reinvestment Act and ways to get financial institutions to be more accountable to low-income, low-wealth communities. And you can find their information at www.ncrc.org. You can find me also on X, Twitter, Dedrick M. Even have a Facebook page, Bridging the Racial Wealth Divide Facebook page, to find that type of information.
Okay, find another question. I've got a lot of comments in from, we've got a strong indigenous nations community participating today.
Yes, sir.
Child makes the observation that his tribe, his nation, when he was born, gave him a little bit of money that was set aside from what land the government had quote unquote conquered from us, and he got car money. And when he turned 18, he got money from an individual quote unquote Indian money account. I'm assuming that's analogous to the baby bonds or the.
It sounds like it.
Yeah, I'd like to learn more about that. I often think that we should do more studies of the American Indian situation, because a lot of they have a kind of semi-sovereignty, so that there's areas that they control in terms of education and policing of their communities.
And even the land ownership and these types of things are oftentimes, at least on reservations, tribal lands, are much more community owned, to ensure that it stays within the tribe. My wife is actually part of the Lenape, Nanacoke, Delaware Indian tribes, though they don't have, at least her tribe does not have actual tribal lands. And we did, if you look at, I have a series called Racial Wealth Divide Snapshots, and I've done some writings on Native Americans and the racial wealth divide to look nationally, where that community stands in terms of racial economic inequality.
Yeah, and I'm thinking that we can look to them for some solutions. Now, there's someone named DF says the racial wealth gap is a hustle. I'm going to assume that this is some troll.
Is there a rationale of how it's a hustle?
No, it just goes on to say, "Miss me with this black bourgeoisie bull." Okay, so it doesn't seem like it's a white supremacist. It's some black person that doesn't understand. Go ahead and respond to that.
Yeah, I mean, and again, I don't know what the critique is, but I will put forward that Now racial wealth gap has become a phrase that now everybody wants to address, and everyone is saying that whatever programs they were doing will address the racial wealth gap. So it is true, and I see people like now there's all of these different racial wealth gap positions or racial equity positions at corporations and what have you. So yes, I do see that people can use now the interim, like, it used to be diversity and inclusion. It's always different things. And if you want to use these things to move yourself forward in corporations or nonprofits, you can. So there can be a hustle to that. I won't dismiss that. But I also think if you look at the data, the racial wealth divide is real and is central to ending racial inequality in the United States. So I think both of those things can be true.
That is absolutely true. Okay. August 3rd is asking you to go back and further tease out the difference between faith and hope.
Well, and again, I was kind of pulling from Reverend Sharpton's sermons about this idea is what's that popular biblical phrase? Evidence of things unseen, something hoped for, what have you. But the idea is that faith is, even despite what you see in front of you, you have faith that whatever your belief is real, and that you can get to that. Outside of hope, where oftentimes people can have this idea that I have hope that this is that we are about to succeed because things are looking better and brighter. And so I'm just looking at the idea of faith as being much more foundational, despite what we see. Because if I was just looking at what I was looking around me, I would say, well, right now, we're not going to have economic inequality, income inequality for 500 years, and wealth equality for 800 years. So I think it requires faith, not just hope, in order to kind of continue on, despite the fact that I've been writing about this and talking about this for 20 years, and we're still haven't made a substantive progress. But I think if you look at the history of Black people, particularly in the United States, you can see the need for faith because the progress has been so slow, even though there has been progress in different areas.
So are you essentially taking the king position that the arc of the moral universe bends toward justice?
Yes, out of faith, though. I think some people might, do a historical analysis, and you could debate it one way or the other. But I do think you're right. You're getting to this faith, and not just Kingian. I think Malcolm X had faith. A lot of you have faith take you in different directions, and I do have faith in justice. I think some people might have faith, and I think that's different than having faith in the United States. You can have faith in justice and not necessarily have faith in the United States. A lot of people try to make King into a faith of the goodness of the United States. And I think if you actually look at where King was in the last years of his life, that actually isn't where King was. I think he did have faith in a justice that went beyond the United States and actually required a confrontation with the United States.
Yeah, I think you hit that on the head. One of the things that I liked about the new report,
yes, sir,
that it got me thinking, and also, just the way in which you explain things tonight, that King, as early as 1964, had called for a massive program to end poverty, but he also said that attached to that should be a special compensatory program for African Americans and other racially oppressed people. And I think that's what we got. Everybody in this society, if they're working class, if they're some identifiable group that can be messed with by the people who run this society, deserve some compensation for how they have been treated, and etc. But in addition to that, we and other particular folks like the indigenous peoples, the Mexicanos, who have been here since, the U.S. gangstered northern Mexico. We deserve something on top of what all of the oppressed deserve in this society.
Well, and two, there's arguments. I'll take ending racial wealth inequality by any and all means. Meaning, we can do reparations, but if you don't do reparations, you just did some massive government program where everyone has an opportunity for a 0% loan for homes, and we're going to build affordable homes, and then through that, everyone can afford home ownership, and through that, African Americans become majority homeowners, and in a generation, we have equal wealth opportunities. I'll do that too. We still owed reparations, but there's different paths toward bridging this type of inequality. And just this country, when we have had strong wealth building programs, we still manage to keep those who've historically been marginalized, currently marginalized, and making sure they don't get an adequate share of this type of investment. And so I do think it takes a targeting. I was in a meeting with Reverend Sharpton and President Fidel Castro back in 2000. And, Castro said to us, like, he really thought that, and again, this is outright socialist revolution.
Right.
That would end racial inequality in Cuba and racial economic inequality in Cuba. And he said, at least to us, it didn't. And that actually, that things beyond just that mass redistribution of wealth was needed to particularly address the issues of Black Cubans. Now, Cuba, to my knowledge, still has this deep racial economic inequality. Mm-hmm. But, I just want to say, even when you have a strong, massive socialist redistribution, if you don't acknowledge that racial inequality, even your socialist redistribution of wealth won't bridge that inequality.
No, you're absolutely right. In every society that tried to make the move, Venezuela, undoubtedly, I'm blanking. What was his name?
Chavez.
Yes, and Maduro have tried mightily, right, to aid Black people in that situation. And in fact, that's part of the resistance to the socialist agenda in those countries.
Yeah, and in Cuba, and I'm not saying yeah, and in Cuba,
go ahead.
Again, Black Cubans did benefit from the Cuban Revolution, right? Like, it definitely benefited from education and healthcare and these types of things, but still the inequality, the racial inequality, which is much more complex there because you had much more multiracial, interracial households and communities than you did in the United States, particularly in the 60s. But even with that mixture, it's still very clear the poorer the neighborhood, the Blacker the neighborhood. That's even right. In a place that was pretty integrated, or you had many interracial households.
Yeah, you didn't have the apartheid residential structures.
That's right. You had much more the kind of the Spanish kind of racism versus the English that really had complete separation, or much more focused on complete separation of the races.
That's right. But no doubt, and that's a point that we always have to make with white socialists, that no, there's another button that got to be pushed.
Yes, sir.
Absolutely. Yes, sir. We got a couple more. Let me pull up some of the questions here. Well, this one is for me. Is this the new home for the History as a Weapon Black Power Media program? And we have a choice of 8 platforms that we can put a show on. And this time I happen to select the platform Breaking Ground that you're seeing us on. I can't guarantee that will be the platform that I select next time, but we're simultaneously broadcasting on 8 different platforms. Let's see what we got here. Okay, here's a question that says, it would be interesting to hear Dedrick Muhammad with blackonomically speaking. You familiar with blackonomically speaking? It's one of our hosts, Jackie Lukeman, with Dr. Linwood Tawheed.
I'm familiar with Jackie Lukeman, and I listened to the Remix Morning Show, and I did see that there was a show, Blackonomically Speaking. I should listen to that, and would love to engage them. Yeah, I would love to engage them at some point.
Good, good. You know, we're building out our platforms now. We're growing Black Power Media.
No. And it's really interesting. Just the people. Jared Ball, I knew when I was doing work at Morgan University, and we used to go up to his office, and me and him would talk about various issues. And then we found out our mothers knew each other because we both grew up in Columbia, and our mothers knew each other, and we didn't even know that. And then I can't believe I'm blanking on someone else in the morning show.
Male or female?
Atlanta always talking about the Cop City.
Oh, boy, that could be. It's probably the attorney. What is my brother's name? Man, I'm bad. All right.
You're bad. I'm worse. I know him. I've known him for years. When I was in jail for that issue with the police, he got me out of jail as a lawyer. And I'm worse than you. And he was in conversation with me about doing some work with the Malcolm X grassroots movement. But it's just interesting seeing different people I knew in different aspects of my life come together through this Black Power media and watching it grow, you know. And I've been very impressed with
Kamau Franklin. Sorry, Kamau.
He's gonna beat me down. I don't know him. Yeah, it's crazy. That's crazy.
Yeah. He's no longer with Malcolm X. He's with a community.
Oh yeah. No, but back in the day is when I was talking with the Malcolm X grassroots movement. Yeah.
But so let me see what else we got. Praise. I think we have to get the leftover comes from capitalism, as well as feel that's what happened with the new Jewel movement. This is from August 3rd. I'm not precisely sure what they're saying.
Wait. Sorry. Would you read that one more time? He says something about the new Jewel movement from Grenada.
Yeah. I think we have to get the leftover BS that comes from capitalism as well. I feel that's what happened with the new Jewel movement.
That's interesting. Well, I don't know exactly what he's talking about. It is interesting that I actually, maybe 20 years after the invasion of Grenada, I went and spent the summer in Grenada with Decima Williams, who was the ambassador of Maurice Bishop to the United States, and kind of got left there when the revolutionary government was overthrown. So I had some familiarity with the study of what happened in Grenada, but I'm not exactly sure what his points are in that comment.
Yeah, it's unclear. Okay. All right, we're coming close to 2 minutes. We're time to wrap up, and I want to say I really am glad that we were able to make this happen, and and that was part of my motivation, that just couldn't afford to cancel anymore. And the idea that the report had come out recently, turns out it was August rather than Tuesday, but the point is that to help give it some publicity, because we need to read it. There's a lot to learn there.
No, I appreciate it. And actually, I've been out of work all week, sick. And I was getting myself together, and I was like, we can't cancel because we've been trying to do this for about 5 months. So I'm glad we both pulled ourselves together to do it. And thank you again for this platform and giving me opportunity to talk about this work.
Thank you, my brother. So I'm gonna take you out now and end the show.
Yes, sir.
And to credits.